In part two of today's content on the spaces of consumption, I want to take a kind of very short synopsis really of the histories of the way these spaces have evolved. And they have a lot to do with the development of feudalism to capitalism, from kind of nation-state economies to globalised economies in particular, and particularly the way that we're, as consumers, increasingly distant from the producers of our things. And I suppose, here we don't necessarily know the person who's produced the stuff that we buy. We don't necessarily kind of go and talk to an individual baker or a butcher to buy our bread or our meat or whatever. And there's a kind of increasing distance between that production and consumption. Much of the development of these new consumer spaces kind of are often being, I suppose, described as the shiny facade of consumer capitalism that distances the consumer from some of the unethical practices of the production of our things that we'll go into later on in the courses. So these have been placed as the idea of the cathedral of modern commerce, palaces for the middle class, and they've been particularly placed as kind of, ways of kind of thinking about the way people congregate in an increasingly secularized society. In many respects, kind of social theorists have started to advocate that maybe the mall and the shopping centre have taken the place of the church in society in terms of maintaining notions of power, discipline and control. So certainly the change from the market, from the feudal to the industrial, has been an important factor in developing these places as well. As things are increasingly mass-produced, they need to be stored somewhere, they need to be shipped, and there needs to be some kind of mediating interface between the production and the consumption that makes it easiest for the buy these things. And things like huge shopping markets become nodes for the consumption in that sense. Obviously, at the same time as kind of technologies and materials develop, these things also develop changes in terms of how the marketplace changes. So the development of building materials, transport, certainly the rise of refrigeration has seen the distance between where things are produced and where they're consumed increased, and certainly the social distance between producers and consumers, for the most part, disappear. Now, it's important to point out there that in very recent times, maybe the rise of the kind of hipster, artisanal, kind of organic consumption and the niche markets around them may be seen as somewhat of a reaction against that distance. Others might argue it's just been a kind of cynical marketing opportunity to, I suppose, exploit some of the sentiment for people that want some more social closeness in those relationships. But there has been a rise of a more kind of mundane, close relationship between production and consumption, particularly with the rise of markets. And you can see those in Newcastle with the farmers market every Sunday. That's incredibly popular these days, and Olive Tree and stuff like that happens once a month. So these histories, though, in terms of how these kind of huge cathedrals of consumption have developed, kind of reflect key changes in markets between producers and consumers, reflect key technological developments that drive these changes, and fundamentally change our relationship to things. So Walter Benjamin's work, a Frankfurt School theorist, has been particularly important for thinking about this stuff. And what he kind of theorised and wrote about was the rise of a new way of shopping, where shopping itself went from an activity based on necessity, where you would just basically go and buy things that you needed to live, food in particular, and clothing for warmth, where I suppose the rise of the mass consumer necessitated that we would increasingly that the market would need people to start viewing shopping as a form of leisure, something to be enjoyed in their spare time rather than just something that they necessarily have to do to survive. So we see the rise of what we could call the shopper's gaze, if we want to kind of develop more the idea of the tourist gaze that we were looking at a few weeks ago, which shifts needs to wants, necessity to luxury, and this sees the rise of the birth of what we now know as the window shopper. And this is particularly the case where you see, many people will go and just hang out at shopping malls and not even buy stuff. They might go and have a meal, but they'll just, walk around, often fairly aimlessly, just looking through stuff. This notion of the window shopper is being particularly influenced by Benjamin's idea of the flaneur, who he wrote about in terms of the rise of the Paris arcades in particular, where people, were just wander around the city with what Simil called a blasé attitude, where you're looking at things, looking at other people, and you want other people to look at you. And again, you can see, notions of distinction and conspicuous and consumption coming into this notion of the flaneur as well. So these kind of changes, see from the changes in the way that things are exchanged, from markets where the producer is there with the thing that they sell, to the arcade, to department stores, to malls, which see that distance ever increase. So in this sense, shopping fundamentally changes as it changes from the idea of necessity to leisure in particular. One of the things is it's about looking rather than speaking, so there's a less kind of human connection going on here, that window shopper idea where the things are just in the window, you float on by. Value here moves from use value to symbolic value. Shopping is not about work, but it's about leisure and pleasure. It's something to do. It's something to do on the weekend, a leisure practice in and of itself. But there are also places to go, to be looked at, and to look at other people. The attachment to products becomes around desire rather than need, particularly as advertising itself promotes desire and fantasy around products. And this is an interesting kind of everyday critique of the notion of Homo economicus. Advertising itself, tries to arouse desires in us, yet well the dominant kind of model of what it means to be a human in economics is this kind of rational decision-making machine. So you can see, examples of the way that desire is trying to be produced rather than need in any episode of Mad Men and the Gruen Transfer and the likes of that, where that kind of stuff is writ large as part of those shows. What we also see here is the kind of change in concentration of who these spaces are appealing to. Now, originally it was certainly to middle class and upper class women, but this has kind of changed over time as the mall becomes more a kind of popular place for everyone to go to. But still, it tends to be dominated more by women attending those places rather than men in terms of the gender balance there. And there's been a hell of a lot of sociological work around this through feminist class critiques and things like that. So here the argument here is that as the spaces where consumption happens, where that exchange between the producer and the consumer happens, changes, the fundamental things that shopping is about also changes, and changes in really rapid ways over the past century.